Rudolf Jung's German Volk and Reich establishes the historical and ideological foundations of National Socialism by presenting a critical analysis of German history through a Völkisch lens. This section argues that the German people's historical trajectory has been one of tragic misdirection, primarily due to the adoption of foreign, internationalist ideals that severed the nation from its organic, racial, and spiritual roots. Jung's narrative is not a mere recounting of events, but a polemical treatise designed to diagnose the ailments afflicting the German body politic and prescribe a radical, nationalist, and socialist remedy. Jung posits that the German Reich, beginning with the coronation of Otto I in the 10th century, took a catastrophic wrong turn. The pursuit of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation was a fundamental error, an unnatural covenant with Rome, and an un-German imperial delusion. This ambition transformed a potentially robust Völkisch kingship, akin to the developing states of France and England, into a supranational entity concerned with abstract universalist claims of world domination rather than the concrete task of national consolidation and Eastern settlement. This misstep had dire, centuries-long consequences. 1. Neglect of Eastern expansion. The fruitless campaigns in Italy caused the neglect of the natural Drang nach Osten, drive to the east. Jung asserts that had the Saxon, Salian, and Hohenstaufen rulers focused on consolidating and Germanizing the Slavic tribes to the east, Courland, Livonia, Estonia, Poland, and the Sudetenland would be German today. 2. Internal fragmentation, Kleinstaaterei. The struggle with the papacy and the subsequent empowerment of regional princes after the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, shattered central authority, leading to a debilitating patchwork of minor states that rendered the Reich a mere phantom of itself. 3. Religious schism. The Reformation introduced a permanent ecclesiastical schism between Catholic and Protestant Germans. Jung argues this eternal dichotomy prevented the German people from achieving the unified national consciousness enjoyed by the French or Czechs, making them primarily either Catholic or Protestant, rather than wholly German. He notes with disdain that the papacy campaigned for peace only when Germany was victorious, but remained silent during the imposition of the post-World War I shameful peace. Jung contrasts the corrupted state of the modern era with an idealized view of the early Germanic and medieval socio-economic order, which he presents as authentically socialist and Völkisch. Land law. He describes the old Germanic cooperative law, Markgenossenschaft, where land was primarily common property and private ownership was limited to what an individual could earn and improve through his own labor, inheritance. This system ensured broad access to the soil and prevented the emergence of a parasitic landowning class. The feudal system's degeneration. Initially, the feudal nobility and church received land as a fiefdom, a loan, in exchange for providing military protection and administrative services, a justifiable form of ground rent. However, the heritability of fiefs and the introduction of Roman law perverted this system. The nobility gradually appropriated more rights, transformed into a privileged caste living off unearned income, and enslaved the peasantry, leading to injustices that culminated in the Peasants' War, 1525. The rise of capitalism and Jewish influence. The discovery of America and the influx of precious metals ushered in the Age of Capitalism, characterized by the transition to a monetary economy. This period saw the rise of predatory financial powers like the Fuggers and Welsers, whom Jung equates with modern Jewish financiers like the Rothschilds. The Jewish spirit of usury and mammonism began to infiltrate and corrupt the Germanic economic order. Jung presents Bismarck's unification of the German Reich in 1871 as a magnificent but incomplete achievement. The new Reich, though powerful, was already internally corrupted by the Jewish spirit, which had achieved overwhelming influence in finance, the press, academia, and politics. This internal decay, combined with the internationalist and pacifist poison spread by Marxism and democracy, left the Reich vulnerable. The ultimate collapse in 1918 is framed not as a military defeat, but as a spiritual surrender, orchestrated by internal enemies, the red, black, and gold internationals, Marxist, Catholic, and liberal capitalist. all of which served, knowingly or unknowingly, the goal of Jewish world supremacy. The Versailles Diktat is thus the culmination of this historical betrayal, a deliberate act of enslavement imposed by a hostile world dominated by Judaic capitalism and its allies, intended to make Germany the servant nation of the earth. For Jung, the historical lesson is clear. The German people's strength lies in a return to their own essence, their blood, their spirit, and their soil. The Germanic era of modern capitalism, represented by productive, creative entrepreneurs like Krupp, must be reclaimed from the Jewish era of rootless international finance capital. The goal of National Socialism, as laid out in this foundational chapter, is the creation of a free social pan-Germany. This means 1. Völkisch unity, the consolidation of all German territories into a unified racial state. 2. Socialist economics, the eradication of unearned income, ground rent interest, and the establishment of an economic order that guarantees the full proceeds of labor to the productive worker, whether intellectual or physical. 3. Spiritual revolution, a moral and religious renewal in the German spirit, purging the nation of alien influences, particularly the Jewish commercial spirit. In essence, German Volk and Reich serves as a call to arms for a national and socialist revolution that would break the chains of both international capitalism and Marxist internationalism, ensuring the survival and supremacy of the German Volk through the establishment of an organic, hierarchical, and racially pure people's state. Jung's chapter, Changes in Land Law, serves as a critical component of his National Socialist Manifesto, providing the historical and theoretical justification for the movement's radical stance on property and soil. This section is not a dispassionate historical analysis, but a polemical narrative designed to trace the origins of modern social decay to a fundamental perversion of what Jung posits as the authentic, organic Germanic relationship between a people and their land. His argument establishes that the current unsound distribution of land is the original sin of the social order, creating a parasitic class of landowners and directly leading to the racial and physical decay of the German folk. Jung begins by idealizing the early Germanic socio-agrarian structure, which he presents as a model of natural Völkisch socialism. In this system, land was not a mere commodity, but the sacred common property of the Markgenossenschaft, village cooperative. Private ownership in the modern sense was limited. Only the house, farm, and garden were considered the individual's hard-earned inheritance. Forests, meadows, pastures, and water remained communal assets, ensuring every member of the community had access to the resources necessary for life. This system was inherently cooperative and martial, as full rights of citizenship were intrinsically tied to land ownership and the duty of military service, the most prestigious duty. This structure created a society of free peasants and a genuine folk nobility, Edelinge, whose larger estates were worked by prisoners of war and servants. Crucially, Jung argues that the feudal system that followed initially retained a kernel of this Germanic cooperative spirit, even in servitude. The bonded peasants had their own courts, Grundhold Court, and the knights and nobility, in theory, provided military protection and administrative services in return for the ground rent they received from peasant labor. This relationship, while hierarchical, was originally framed as a reciprocal exchange of duties, not naked exploitation. The historical turning point, according to Jung, was the corruption of this feudal contract. The heritability of fiefdoms and, later, the introduction of the saleability of land marked a catastrophic shift from Germanic cooperative law to Roman law, which prioritized absolute private property rights. This was the genesis of what National Socialism identifies as unearned income, Arbeitsloses Einkommen. With their military role diminished by the invention of gunpowder and the rise of mercenary armies, the nobility's claim to privilege became unjust. Ground rent, once a compensation for service, was now extracted illegitimately. The nobility, especially the higher aristocracy and the church, used their power to aggressively expand their holdings through marriage, endowment, and naked robbery, creating the vast latifundia, great estates that characterize the modern era. Simultaneously, they stripped the villages of their commons and imposed oppressive privileges like exclusive hunting rights, brutally enforced. The peasantry, once free, found themselves trapped. The cessation of eastward settlement and the sealing of city borders closed off avenues of escape. Their condition became unbearable, inevitably sparking the Peasants' War of 1525. Jung notes pointedly that the peasants' demands were not revolutionary but modest and just: abolition of serfdom, regulation of tithes and labor duties, and the restoration of communal lands. Their defeat drowned these reasonable aspirations in a sea of blood, cementing the power of the new exploitative landowning class. Jung then directly connects this historical injustice to the contemporary plight of the German people. He provides statistical evidence from Old Austria showing a grotesquely unequal distribution of land, where a minuscule fraction of the population, 0.0252%, controlled over 13% of the total land area. These vast estates, held by families like Liechtenstein and Schwarzenberg, are condemned as doubly harmful: economic harm. They dictate agricultural policy to the detriment of the masses, driving up food prices and depressing wages for agricultural workers. Racial völkisch harm, rassisch völkisch. Most critically, they block the German people's access to the soil. This forces a rural exodus into overcrowded cities, leading to miserable housing, epidemic diseases, infant and child mortality, the physical, mental, and moral decay of the broad masses of our folk. In the Sudetenland specifically, this land monopoly actively prevented internal German settlement, deliberately condemning Germans to a minority status and facilitating their oppression by Slavic majorities. Jung sharply distinguishes National Socialist land reform from the unadulterated Hussitism of Czech land redistribution, which he views as a cynical tool for breaking up German settlement blocks. True reform, he contends, is only possible under German self-government. The chapter concludes by framing the issue as existential. The call for a return to German land rights is presented as the only path to national resurgence. The goal is crystal clear: a folk who live freely upon free land are unconquerable. This means breaking the monopolistic power of the landed aristocracy and the financial interests, the Jewish moneylender, that replaced them, and restoring the fundamental connection between the German family and its plot of soil, its Heimat. In essence, changes in land law provides the historical grievance that demands a national socialist revolution. It argues that economic emancipation and völkisch survival are inseparable. You cannot have a healthy, powerful German folk without first dismantling the unjust land laws that have enslaved them for centuries and returning to a romanticized vision of Germanic socialist order. The land must be liberated from the parasite, so the Volk can be liberated on the land. In the chapter Social Economy in the Middle Ages, Jung constructs a powerful and idealized portrait of medieval Germanic economic life, presenting it as a golden age of social organization, prosperity, and Völkisch integrity. This historical excavation is not an exercise in nostalgia, but a deliberate political strategy. Jung uses this idealized past as a sharp rhetorical weapon to condemn the perceived degeneracy, exploitation, and alienation of the modern capitalist era, which he views as poisoned by the Jewish commercial spirit. His depiction serves to prove that a truly social economy, a national socialist economy, is not a utopian fantasy, but a return to the authentic, organic order of the German folk. Jung's central argument is that the medieval German economy was fundamentally cooperative, not individualistic. The old Germanic concept of the Genossenschaft, cooperative, was the living heart of this system, finding its highest expression in the guilds. These were not merely economic unions, but comprehensive social institutions that regulated quality, prices, and most importantly, the moral and racial character of their members. Racial and moral purity guild statutes explicitly restricted membership to those of honest German ancestry, barring those of un-German bastard children or Lausch associates. This demonstrates for Jung an innate Völkisch consciousness that placed the health of the community above individual profit. Dignity of labor. Journeymen had powerful associations that protected their honor and interests, even to the point of launching formal strikes over matters of dignity, such as their placement in a city procession. Wages were high, diets were ample and nutritious. The common folk rarely had fewer than 4 dishes to a meal, and the work week was short, often only 4 days, with numerous holidays and the tradition of Blue Monday. Profit sharing and status. Often, journeymen worked for a share of the profits, e.g. 1/3 of the earnings, rather than a fixed wage, a system Jung applauds as an early form of profit sharing that aligned the interests of the worker and the master. Jung extends this cooperative model to the broader economic and municipal structure, contrasting it favorably with the dysfunctions of his own time. Sound land law. The city, representing the community, was the true master of the soil. Citizens were granted land in hereditary entail, Erbpacht, for a modest land tax, a system Jung likens to the single tax proposed by land reformer Henry George. This prevented land speculation and usury. Strict laws ensured plots were built upon promptly, and derelict properties reverted to the city, making land price inflation impossible. Ethical commerce and trade was conducted under strict ethical codes. Speculation and futures trading were prohibited. Merchants enjoyed swift justice in special courts, but faced severe, humiliating punishments for fraud, e.g. dunking a baker for selling underweight loaves, pouring watered-down milk down a vendor's throat. This ensured fairness and maintained the integrity of the marketplace. Role of women in hygiene. Jung notes approvingly that women were active in numerous trades and even in medicine, a sign of a healthy and practical society. He also highlights the high standard of personal hygiene, with public bathhouses commonplace and funded for the poor, a stark contrast to the culture and civilization of 1905, which left over 1,000 towns without public baths. The true purpose of Jung's detailed, idyllic depiction becomes clear through the relentless, implicit comparison with the modern world he wishes to overthrow. For Jung, the metrics of a society's health are not technological complexity or financial wealth, but the physical and moral well-being of its people and the integrity of its communal bonds. The medieval city, with its limited population, cooperative ethos, and ethical economic laws, produced architectural and artistic marvels. The modern industrial metropolis, by contrast, built upon the principles of Roman law, land speculation, and interest-based finance, produces only miserable housing, physical, mental, and moral decay, and the soulless isolation of the proletariat. The medieval worker enjoyed the joy of creation, seeing a project through from start to finish. The modern factory worker is a mere cog in a machine, robbed of this creative spirit and reduced to working for wages. The social economy of the title is not merely a description of the past, but a prescription for the future. It is a call to reject the internationalist, materialist, and Jewish-influenced economic models of liberalism and Marxism. Instead, National Socialism must seek to rebuild a modern equivalent of this medieval ideal, a closed, cooperative, Völkisch economy where the value of productive labor is honored, unearned income is abolished, and the community's welfare is placed above the selfish interests of the individual or the parasitic financier. The medieval period in Jung's telling proves that such a society is not only possible, but is the natural state of the healthy German folk. In this pivotal chapter titled The Transition to a Pure Monetary Economy and to Factory Production Enterprises, Jung charts the historical decline from the idealized, socially rooted economy of the Middle Ages into the soulless, exploitative system of modern capitalism. He identifies this transition as a catastrophic revolution, engineered not by technology alone, but by the corrupting influence of the Jewish spirit of usury and materialism. For Jung, the shift to a pure monetary economy and the rise of the factory system represent the final disembodiment of the German worker, the destruction of the joy of labor, and the total victory of mammon over the organic Völkisch community. Jung begins by pinpointing the theological and moral collapse that enabled the economic revolution. The medieval church's prohibition on usury, rooted in the biblical injunction against charging interest, was a bulwark protecting the Christian Germanic social order. This barrier was first breached not by a secular force, but from within. The Catholic theologian Dr. Eck's 1515 declaration that a 4 to 5% interest rate was permissible. Though Luther initially railed against the Fuggers and other great merchants as parasites who eat up some great king in a year, he too eventually capitulated, despairing of a total ban and settling for rate reductions. This theological surrender coincided with the geopolitical and economic upheavals of the age. The discovery of America and the sea route to India flooded Europe with precious metals, triggering massive inflation. Everything became substantially more expensive, and shifting economic power from the productive lands of Central Europe to the maritime commercial empires of Spain, England, and the Netherlands. The great trading houses like the Fuggers became state-makers, bankrolling emperors and amassing profits as high as 54.5%, thus cementing the new power of mobile capital over rooted, productive labor. With the old feudal order broken, a new power structure emerged, the centralized mercantilist state. Jung argues that these states, in their ruthless pursuit of wealth and power, became the primary engines of capitalist exploitation, laying the groundwork for the industrial factory system. State-sponsored oppression. The state's focus was on population growth and wealth acquisition to feed its military apparatus. This led to the creation of manufactories, the forerunners of factories, which were characterized by brutal exploitation. Child labor was systematized and hailed by economists as a cure for heightened idleness. Wages were suppressed by law, and workers were stripped of medieval privileges like the Blue Monday. The state, in essence, became the chief capitalist, organizing production for its own power and sacrificing the welfare of its people at the altar of mercantilist policy. The factory. The invention of machinery completed this process of dehumanization. Jung makes a critical distinction. The factory is not merely a larger workshop, it is a qualitatively different entity where work became soulless, man a machine. The medieval journeyman took pride in his creation, seeing a piece of himself in his finished work. The modern industrial worker is robbed of this joy of creation, his labor fragmented and meaningless as the product rushes through countless hands and machines. This, for Jung, is the ultimate tragedy, the transformation of the proud German creator into a disinherited, uprooted proletarian cheated of his human happiness. Underpinning this entire historical analysis is Jung's core racial and ideological argument. The transition he describes is not a neutral process of economic development, but a story of spiritual corruption. The daring merchant of yore, the Germanic entrepreneur, was increasingly displaced by the figure of the usurer. The Jewish spirit, which had operated on the margins in the Middle Ages, now moved to the center of economic life, finding its purest expression in the abstract, ruthless logic of money and interest. The Germanic era of capitalism, represented by tough productive builders like Krupp and Schickau, was gradually superseded. The era of the individual entrepreneur gave way to the age of the anonymous, jointly owned enterprise, share company, the cartel, and finally the trust. Massive, soulless conglomerates like Rockefeller's oil empire and Morgan Steel Trust, which Jung identifies as the true rulers of the world and the hidden hand behind events like America's entry into World War I. Jung's chapter serves as a profound indictment of the entire modern economic order. He demonstrates that capitalism is not built on freedom and innovation, but on a historical regression, the abandonment of social and ethical constraints on lending, the state-led enslavement of labor, and the ultimate degradation of work itself into a meaningless activity. This historical narrative provides the essential justification for the National Socialist economic program. If the current system was born from a moral collapse and the ascendancy of a foreign spirit, then its overthrow is not a destruction of order but a restoration of it. The goal of National Socialism is to reverse this centuries-long trend, to break the power of loan capital and interest slavery, to restore the dignity of creative labor, and to dismantle the factory system in favor of an economy that serves the Völkisch community, not the abstract profits of international finance. The transition to the monetary factory system, as Jung tells it, is the story of a fall from grace. National Socialism promises the path to redemption. In Materialism and Mammonism, Jung delivers a scorching critique of the modern era, arguing that its boasts of culture and progress are a hollow facade, masking a profound spiritual and physical decay. This decay, he contends, is the direct product of two intertwined forces: materialism, the glorification of the crazily sensuous and the rejection of higher ideals, and mammonism, the ruthless rule of money and the Jewish spirit of finance capital. For Jung, the breathtaking technological advancements of the 19th and 20th centuries do not represent true culture, but are instead the instruments of a pathological economic system designed to enrich a parasitic class while enslaving and debasing the productive German folk. Jung begins by drawing a crucial distinction crucial to the National Socialist worldview: the difference between Kultur and civilization. Culture is innate, völkisch, and spiritual. It encompasses the intellectual, artistic, and moral religious creations rooted in the specific genius of a race. The Gothic cathedrals, the works of Goethe and Schiller, the music of Beethoven and Wagner, these are expressions of true German culture. Civilization is international, materialistic, and superficial. Operettas, movies, tabloid journalism, and even technological marvels are merely customs, not culture. They are a mishmash of humanity that lacks soul and moral foundation. The modern age, in its obsession with luxury, comfort, and technological spectacle, has championed civilization at the expense of culture, replacing profound creation with shallow consumption. This is the essence of materialism, the elevation of the material over the spiritual, the individual over the community. Jung then traces the structural evolution of capitalism, framing it as a descent from a heroic Germanic model into a purely parasitic Jewish one. The Germanic era of capitalism, the early industrial revolution, was led by tirelessly active individual entrepreneurs like Krupp and Schickau, highly gifted men of unquenchable creative drive who built empires from humble beginnings. Though often ruthless, they were producers, modern-day Vikings whose purpose was creation, not just profit. The rise of the parasite. This productive era was supplanted by the age of the anonymous share company, where decision-making power shifted from capable individuals to the abstract quantity of owned stock. This process was accelerated and controlled by the banks, which Jung identifies as the supreme god of the modern economy. They orchestrate the formation of cartels and trusts, stifling competition to create private monopolies that artificially inflate prices and exploit the consumer. The rule of mammon. Jung presents trusts like Rockefeller's oil empire and Morgan Steel Trust as quasi-governmental entities that control global production and dictate national policies. Their power is absolute, surpassing that of nations. He explicitly argues that America's entry into World War I was motivated not by idealism, but by the fervent cry of the American billionaire's soul for control of European markets. The chapter's most forceful polemic is reserved for the banking system, the central nervous system of mammonism. Jung provides statistics to show how banks, through their supervisory boards, achieved an iron grip over industry, commerce, and public life. Their influence became particularly predatory during World War I, where they leveraged state-controlled manufacturing for staggering profits. He notes that the net profits of 8 major Viennese banks increased by 62 million kronen in just 5 war years, proving that the vulture feels most comfortable upon a field of corpses. This leads to Jung's central unifying argument. Mammonism is the economic expression of the Jewish spirit. The bank's profit-seeking is not mere greed, but a deliberate strategy of subjugation. The World War and the ensuing peace terms of Versailles are, in this lens, not political events, but economic ones. The successful effort of international loan capital to enslave the productive nations, Germany chief among them. The endless debt imposed by Versailles is the ultimate weapon of this financial tyranny, designed to perpetually drain the wealth created by German labor. Materialism and mammonism serves as a declaration of war. Jung concludes that the present economic collapse is not a temporary crisis, but the inevitable result of a system rotten at its core. The banks continue to proliferate because loan capital is not doing too badly, thriving on the misery it creates. The chapter solidifies the ideological enemy for National Socialism. The struggle is not merely against an economic system, but against a spiritual plague. The Marxist focus on the industrial capitalist is a red herring. The true enemy is the international financier, the non-productive money lord who generates nothing and consumes everything. Therefore, the National Socialist economic revolution must aim beyond the expropriation of factories. It must seek the utter destruction of the entire interest-based financial system and the materialistic worldview that sustains it. The goal is to break the power of mammon and replace the rule of money with the rule of the Volk, restoring a society where value is derived from productive labor and racial vitality, not from financial speculation and parasitism. In this foundational and incendiary chapter, The Jewish Spirit, the Jewish pursuit of world supremacy, Jung articulates the core anti-Semitic theory that forms the bedrock of National Socialist ideology. He moves beyond economic critique to present a metaphysical and historical narrative, arguing that the ills of the modern world, from capitalism and communism to liberalism and moral decay, are not accidental, but are the deliberate products of a singular eternal force, the Jewish spirit, Jüdische Geist. This spirit, innate and immutable, drives a conscious, calculated, and millennia-old pursuit of global domination, making the Jewish question not a minor social issue, but the central racial and existential struggle of human history. Jung preemptively dismisses any notion that Jewish behavior is a reaction to historical persecution. He argues that the key to understanding the Jew is found in their own holy texts, which he quotes extensively to paint a picture of a people fundamentally and divinely ordained to be parasitic, usurious, and supremacist. Biblical foundation of parasitism, citing passages from Genesis, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah, e.g., "Remain a stranger in this country, you shall consume every nation." Jung posits that Judaism, from its inception, was a creed of ethnic exploitation. He uses the stories of Jacob cheating Esau and Joseph in Egypt to illustrate a pattern of deception, theft, and living off the productive labor of others. The Jew is by his very nature the plain man who dwelt in the tents, who dresses in wool and eats what is fatted but does not tend the flock. The God of destruction, Jung sharply distinguishes the Jewish Yahweh from the Aryan conception of God. Yahweh is not a benevolent father, but El Shaddai, a desert god of destruction, vengeance, and lies, the father of lies, as Jesus called him. This theology, Jung argues, reflects and reinforces the Jewish spirit, which has never built up, always only destroyed. Rejection of the Messiah. The crucifixion of Christ is presented as the ultimate proof of Jewish nature. They rejected Jesus because he offered a kingdom of the Spirit, not the worldly power and splendor they desired. Their hope for a Messiah has always been, Jung asserts, a hope for gold, outer splendor, and power and dominion over subjugated nations. Jung transitions from historical analysis to contemporary conspiracy by invoking the protocols of the Elders of Zion, outlining the Jewish strategy for global hegemony. He quotes them to demonstrate that what appears as chaotic modern phenomena, division, moral confusion, economic strife, are in fact calculated weapons. Key strategies he highlights include the weaponization of ideals, the slogans of liberty, equality, fraternity, and the concepts of democracy and socialism are revealed as bait to deceive the Gentiles, destroy national solidarity, and overthrow the existing order. Economic sabotage, deliberately engineering wage increases that are nullified by inflation, promoting anarchism and alcoholism among workers, and controlling the gold supply to create economic dependency. Control of information, establishing sham institutions and dominating the press to shape public opinion and mask their true intentions. This proves for Jung that all international movements, whether the Golden International of Capitalism or the Red International of Communism, are mere different fronts in the same Jewish war for supremacy. Both lead to the same end, the dictatorship of Jewry. Jung concludes by applying this framework directly to Germany's fate. He uses demographic and occupational statistics to argue that the Wilhelmine Reich was already an out-and-out Jewish state before World War I. Jews were grotesquely overrepresented in law, medicine, finance, press, and politics, wielding an influence utterly disproportionate to their numbers. This Jewish spirit infected German policy, blinding the nation to its true Völkisch mission and orienting it toward a commercial, Western-facing path that inevitably aroused the envy and hatred of other nations. Therefore, World War I was not a political conflict, but a necessary step in the Jewish plan. The German Reich, as the last major obstacle to global Jewish domination, had to be eliminated. The Jewish-led press in Berlin and London, the Jewish politicians and pacifists, all worked in concert to demoralize the home front and ensure Germany's defeat. The resulting Treaty of Versailles, with its crushing debt, is not a peace treaty, but an instrument of financial enslavement crafted by and for international loan capital. This chapter is the ultimate synthesis of Jung's argument. It connects the dots between his economic, historical, and social critiques, uniting them under a single malevolent actor. The Jewish spirit is the cause of the unjust land law, the sin of usury, the rise of materialism, and the tyranny of mammon. The logical conclusion is inescapable. There can be no accommodation, reform, or assimilation. The struggle against Jewry is a struggle for the very existence of the German folk and all productive humanity. It is a racial and spiritual war that must be fought with absolute resolve. Any political or economic program that fails to recognize and attack this root cause is, in the National Socialist view, naive and doomed to failure. The liberation of Germany and the world requires not just a political revolution, but a total purification, a cleansing of the Jewish spirit from all spheres of life. This is the supreme task that National Socialism sets for itself. In Democracy, International, and Collapse, Jung presents a forensic autopsy of the German Empire, diagnosing the cause of its death not as a military defeat, but as a terminal illness born from internal spiritual and political decay. He argues that the Weimar Republic and the post-war order are not fresh starts, but the triumphant culmination of a long-planned assault by international forces, red, Marxist, black, ultramontane Catholic, and gold, liberal capitalist, all operating under the overarching influence of the Jewish spirit. For Jung, democracy and internationalism are not ideals, but the very weapons used to dismantle the German state, ensuring its collapse and subsequent enslavement. Jung begins by dismantling the concept of democracy, which he defines not as rule by the people, but as party terrorism. He contrasts it with the Germanic model of leadership and the Thing, assembly of free men, arguing that the imported parliamentary system is inherently corrupt and dysfunctional. Parliamentary democracy, in Jung's view, ensures that power is seized not by the best and most capable, but by the most conniving and well-connected. Governments and officials feel responsible only to their party, not the nation, leading to cronyism, venality, and the absolute rule of partisan interests. He cites the chaos and gossip of the German Reichstag as proof of its immaturity and incompetence. Jung concedes that mechanisms like referendums or proportional representation might mitigate the worst abuses, but he believes the fundamental flaw is irredeemable. Democracy prioritizes the shallow, divisive game of party politics over the unified will of the folk. It is a system designed to be manipulated, and in Germany, it was manipulated to perfection by its enemies. Jung identifies three international movements that worked in concert to subvert the German Reich from within, despite their apparent differences. The Golden International, liberal capitalism, represented by the bourgeois Democrats and the Jewish financial press, this force sought to align Germany with Western, Anglo-French interests, promoting a commercial, pacifist, and materialistic worldview that was inherently anti-national. It was the political arm of Mammonism, the Black International, political Catholicism, ultramontanism. Rooted in the Vatican and the Habsburg court, this force was driven by an ancient hatred for the Protestant Prussian power and the unified German Reich. It promoted particularism, clerical influence, and a supranational loyalty to Rome that directly opposed German unity. The Red International, Marxism, a social democracy, the most dangerous of all, as it corrupted the German working class. Under the guise of socialism, Marxist leaders preached class hatred, international brotherhood, and pacifism, systematically demoralizing the nation and sabotaging the war effort. Jung provides statistics to show the overwhelming Jewish leadership within the socialist and communist parties, proving they were not a German workers' movement but a Jewish revolutionary instrument. These three forces, though seemingly opposed, found common cause in their hatred for the Bismarckian state and their subservience to non-German international agendas. The central thesis of Jung's chapter is that Germany was not defeated on the battlefield, but was deliberately made to collapse from within. The war merely provided the backdrop for this internal coup. Jung supports his claim with a barrage of statistics demonstrating Jewish overrepresentation in key fields. Jews constituted 937 of 3,140 university teachers, instead of a proportional 31, 43% of lawyers, instead of 1%, and held a staggering 794 supervisory board positions among just 23 individuals. They dominated the press, finance, and medicine. The Reich, therefore, was already a Jewish state in everything but name, its policies skewed to serve international rather than Völkisch interests. During the war, this internal fifth column went to work. The Jewish-controlled press in both Berlin and London, Northcliffe Stern, conducted a relentless campaign of vilification. Marxist leaders sabotaged morale on the home front, while politicians like Erzberger and bureaucrats like Walter Rathenau engineered a social policy that created scarcity and black markets. The Pope's peace proposal and the activities of pacifists further undermined the national will to fight. The November Revolution was the final act of this betrayal. Instead of turning their weapons against the true enemy of all workers, international finance capital, the Marxist-led revolutionaries disarmed Germany, destroyed the state, and delivered the nation bound and gagged to the Entente. The resulting Versailles Diktat was not a peace treaty but a death warrant, the intended outcome of this decades-long campaign of subversion. Jung's analysis leads to a single stark conclusion. The collapse of 1918 was a Selbstmord, suicide. The German folk, drugged by the poisonous ideals of democracy, internationalism, and materialism, allowed itself to be disarmed and dismantled by its internal enemies. This chapter serves as the ultimate cautionary tale for the National Socialist movement. It proves that political systems like democracy are fatal vulnerabilities that can be exploited by hostile forces. It demonstrates that internationalism, in any form, is a lethal threat to national existence. And most importantly, it confirms that the Jewish spirit is not a passive cultural influence, but an active, relentless, and supremely effective force of destruction. Therefore, the rebirth of Germany requires not just political reform, but a total war against these three evils: the eradication of democracy, the utter destruction of all internationalist thought, and the complete purification of the national body from the Jewish influence that engineered its collapse. In At the Gates to the Future, Jung transitions from a historical critic to a revolutionary prophet, outlining a path for national resurrection from the ashes of the Versailles Diktat. While acknowledging the depth of Germany's humiliation and despair, he vehemently rejects fatalism, grounding his hope not in a naive belief in changing international winds, but in a profound faith in the indomitable vitality of the German folk and the inherent superiority of their spirit. This chapter is a call to arms, arguing that the present suffering is the necessary crucible for forging a new, higher form of state and society, the free social pan-Germany of National Socialism. Jung begins by confronting the profound demoralization of the German people, a pathological addiction to self-emasculation fostered by the victory of pacifist and internationalist ideologies. He contrasts this with the unwavering confidence of the National Socialists, Siegfriedler, who never believed in the drivel about the culture of man and instead always believed in the German folk. His optimism is not based on diplomacy or a change of heart by the Entente, which he deems impossible, but on a deeper historical analysis. Jung frames World War I not as a mere imperialist conflict, but as a fundamental clash of worldviews. It was a struggle between individualism, embodied by the Entente, particularly England, representing the mercantile, selfish, and materialistic Jewish spirit. Socialism, embodied by the German Reich, representing the communal, dutiful, and sacrificial German spirit of collective work and national solidarity. Germany's superior internal organization was, for Jung, a manifestation of this higher socialist ideal. The defeat was not a refutation of this spirit, but a tragic setback, caused by the nation's failure to fully realize it and its contamination by the very individualism it fought against. A central pillar of Jung's argument is a ruthless exposé of the 1918 revolution, as not merely a failure, but a counter-revolution that cemented rather than broke the chains of capitalism. The revolution that benefited the enemy. He articulates the supreme irony. A revolution launched in the name of anti-capitalism resulted in the absolute rule of capitalism. By disarming Germany and surrendering to the Entente, the Marxist leaders delivered the German working class into the hands of its most powerful capitalist adversaries. The reparations debt of 21.7 trillion marks is the price tag of this enslavement, making all Germans, workers included, debt slaves to international loan capital. The fatal flaw of Marxism. Jung argues that Marxism failed because it is built on a foundation of hate and materialism, which are incapable of building a true socialist society based on altruism and sacrifice. Its internationalism is a fraud, as evidenced by the national solidarity of English workers who defended their privileged position as the ruling class of the world. The class struggle is a dangerous diversion from the true conflict, the racial and national struggle between productive and parasitic peoples. Confronting the grim economic reality imposed by Versailles, the loss of industry, coal, iron, and food-producing territories, Jung dismisses the policy of fulfillment as a path to perpetual slavery. He then presents the National Socialist solution with stark, ruthless logic. The demographic imperative. The treaty has created an impossible situation. Germany has 20 million more people than its crippled economy can support. Emigration is impossible as destination countries are closed. The only logical conclusion is that 10 million Germans must have a territory to which they can emigrate. The drive to the east, Drang nach Osten. Pushed by iron necessity, the German folk will be compelled to do what it has always done, turn eastward. Jung coldly notes that Bolshevism has certainly made sure that there are fewer people there, presenting the chaos and depopulation wrought by Jewish Bolshevism as an opportunity for German settlement. This is not presented as wanton aggression, but as a biological and historical inevitability, a natural drive for living space, Lebensraum, forced upon the folk by their enemies. Jung ends not with a detailed policy program, but with a visionary call for spiritual and physical readiness. The immense suffering ahead is reframed as a purifying fire that will burn away the weaknesses of materialism and internationalism, forcing the folk to recognize that salvation can only come from its own strength. The era of National Socialism will be born from this hardship. Its first task will be the resolution of the land question, returning the German to free soil. Industrial losses are deemed secondary, as real value lies in the labor force and in a Volk's unbroken will to live. At the gates to the future is thus a declaration of defiant hope. It argues that the very terms designed to enslave Germany forever, Versailles, contain the seeds of their own destruction. The impossible demands will force the folk to rediscover its essence, its will to power, its capacity for sacrifice, and its right to space and life. The future belongs not to the victors of 1918, but to those with the courage to embrace this struggle, to the National Socialists who stand ready to lead the Volk through the gates of hardship toward their destined future. In Part 2, Rudolf Jung transitions from theoretical exposition to practical declaration, presenting the foundational documents that defined the early National Socialist movement. This section serves as the constitutional core of the book, providing the official platform, resolutions, and ideological boundaries that distinguish National Socialism from all other political forces. Jung presents these documents not as a matter of historical record alone, but as a living testament to the movement's unwavering principles and its assertion of being the sole legitimate heir to the German Völkisch socialist cause. The centerpiece of this section is the guiding principles of the National Socialist Party of the German Volk, adopted at the Interstate Representatives Congress in Salzburg, August 1920. This document is the definitive statement of pre-Hitlerian National Socialist doctrine and establishes several key pillars. Völkisch socialism. The primary commitment is to the liberation of the German working classes, achieved not through international class war, but strictly within the natural limits of his folkdom. This rejects Marxist internationalism and frames socialism as a national project for the elevation of the entire productive Volk. The primacy of reform, the document explicitly states, not revolution and class struggle, but purposeful creative reform work alone can overcome today's untenable social conditions. This positioned the early NSDAP against the revolutionary violence of the Spartacists and communists. The attack on unearned income. It draws a clear line between legitimate private property earned through labor and illegitimate unearned income derived from ground rent, interest, and usury. The goal is to break interest slavery and transfer private monopolies to public ownership. The anti-capitalist and anti-Jewish stance. The party declares itself the enemy of all reactionary tendencies, all clerical, noble, and capitalist privileges, and every racially foreign influence. But above all, does it combat the overwhelming power of the Jewish commercial spirit in all areas of public life. Jung includes the resolutions from the Linz Congress, August 1921, which crucially amended the Salzburg Principles. The original phrase describing the party as no narrow class party was replaced with the declaration that it is the class party of productive labor. This was a profound ideological refinement. Jung clarifies that class is not defined by the Marxist proletariat-bourgeoisie divide, but by the distinction between those who perform productive labor, intellectual or physical, and those who live off unearned income. This redefinition aimed to unite white-collar workers, civil servants, artisans, and the traditional working class against a common enemy. The parasitic financier, speculator, and rentier whom the movement identified overwhelmingly with Jewry. For the Germans in Czechoslovakia, the program required a specific supplement, adopted in Aussig, August 1919. This document is a masterclass in National Socialist pragmatism and reveals the movement's core priority: Völkisch survival above all else, rejection of nationalization. In a stunning reversal of typical socialist demands, the Sudeten Nazis outright rejected any form of state-led economic nationalization within the Czechoslovak state. They recognized that in a hostile ethnic state, a Czech-controlled government would use nationalized industry and land reform not for social justice, but as a weapon for the planned dismemberment and enforcement of enclosed German settlement areas, the primacy of ethnic autonomy. The supplement argues that true socialization can only occur after the achievement of national self-governing territories. Economic goals were therefore subordinated to the paramount political goal of ethnic autonomy and self-determination, without which any economic policy would simply strengthen the hand of the ethnic enemy. Jung concludes with two powerful constitutional declarations that reaffirm the movement's ultimate geopolitical goal. Knirsch's Declaration, 1918, delivered to the Austrian National Assembly, this was the first and most unequivocal call for Anschluss, the constitutional union of German Austria with the German Reich, and a rejection of any Danubian federation with Slavic states. Jung's Declaration, 1920, delivered upon entering the Prague Parliament, this speech is a bold act of ideological defiance. Jung declares the Treaty of Saint-Germain a monstrous historical lie and vows never to recognize the forced incorporation of the Sudetenland into Czechoslovakia as legitimate. He turns the rhetoric of self-determination against the Entente, using the parliamentary platform provided by the state to denounce the state itself. Documents of National Socialism provides the immutable foundation upon which the movement was built. It showcases a sophisticated ideology that fused intense ethnic nationalism with a reformist, anti-capitalist economic program, all under the overarching imperative of combating the Jewish spirit. These documents reveal a movement that was, from its inception, revolutionary in its racial and national aims, strategically flexible in its tactics, e.g. participating in a parliament it sought to destroy, and utterly committed to the creation of a unified social and ethnically purified Pan-Germany. They are the tangible proof that National Socialism was a coherent worldview long before Hitler's rise, with its own distinct answers to the crises of democracy, capitalism, and national identity. In Our Commitment to Folkdom, Jung moves to define the absolute, non-negotiable core of the National Socialist identity, its unconditional and total commitment to the German folk. This chapter serves as an ideological litmus test, systematically analyzing and rejecting all other major political movements of the era, the bourgeois nationalists, the Democrats, the Marxists, and the clericalists, exposing them as false patriots whose conditional loyalties and international allegiances render them incapable of this pure life-or-death commitment. For Jung, true nationalism is not a political preference, but a racial and spiritual totality, and this chapter establishes the inviolable principle of Völkisch solidarity as the bedrock upon which the National Socialist state must be built. Jung begins by dismantling the claims of the bourgeois and conservative nationalist parties. He argues that their so-called pure nationalism is a facade, clouded by compromises that prioritize class and economic interests over the Volk. The bourgeois contradiction. These parties claim to be people's parties, Volksparteien, representing all folk comrades, yet they simultaneously identify as bourgeois bürgerlich. For Jung, this term signifies a rigid defense of the existing unjust distribution of property, an adherence to Roman land law, and a de facto loyalty to the spirit of mammonism and materialism. Their nationalism is thus conditional, contingent on the preservation of their privileged economic status. The democratic deception. Bourgeois Democrats are even worse, acting as the unwitting shield-bearers for Jewry by championing a hollow concept of freedom. This freedom, Jung argues, is merely a Trojan horse for the Jewish spirit, allowing it to operate with impunity while paralyzing the host nations to defend itself from spiritual and racial contamination. Jung then turns his focus to the parties of the left and the Catholic center, condemning them for their explicit internationalism, which he views as the ultimate betrayal of the Volk. He scorches the Marxists for their hypocrisy. While claiming to fight for the working class, they systematically slander their own nation while excusing the faults of others. Their doctrine of class hatred and international proletarian solidarity actively dismantles national cohesion, making them, in his view, incapable of any genuine love for the German folk. They are the shock troops of Jewry, preparing the ground for enslavement. Similarly, movements like Christian socialism are disqualified by their ultramontane nature. Their primary loyalty lies not with the German nation, but with a foreign power, the papacy in Rome. Jung argues that this external allegiance has historically been and remains frequently hostile to German interests, making any claim to true nationalism by clerical parties inherently fraudulent. Having cleared the field of impostors, Jung defines the National Socialist standard. Commitment to folkdom is unconditional rückhaltlos. It requires a loyalty without reservations or prerequisites. It is a commitment to the Volk, whether they choose this or that form of government or this or that economic constitution, whether they are the best folk or the worst. The nation is a community of fate, Schicksalsgemeinschaft, and culture, Kulturgemeinschaft, and its defense is an absolute imperative that transcends all other considerations. Rooted in blood and spirit, this commitment is not to a state or constitution, but to the organic, racial entity of the folk itself. It is an acknowledgement that the natural limits of one's abilities and identity are defined by one's blood. The antidote to internationalism. This principle necessitates the outright rejection of all internationalist creeds, whether the class-based international of Marxism, the financial international of capitalism, or the spiritual international of the papacy, as unnatural and destructive forces. Jung concludes by addressing the charge that Germans are inherently divisive and difficult to unite. He reframes this not as a weakness, but as a testament to their Germanic heritage of individualism and creative independence, a quality that must be harnessed, not destroyed. The path to unity cannot be forced by shallow slogans, but will emerge naturally from a harmony of perspectives forged in the crucible of shared adversity. The suffering imposed by the Versailles Order will ultimately educate the masses, revealing the futility of international solutions and awakening the primal instinct for national self-preservation. The chapter ends with a call to the passionate youth, the gymnasts, the Wandervogel, the student associations, who instinctively feel this commitment. They are the target audience for this message, the ones who possess the fiery heart and tenacious will to ascend the stony path of National Socialism, far from the well-trodden road of compromise and decay. Their energy, channeled through the uncompromising commitment to folkdom, is the essential fuel for the coming renewal. In essence, our commitment to folkdom is the chapter that establishes the primacy of race and nation over all other loyalties, class, creed, or party. It is the argument that before one can build a new state or economy, one must first answer the fundamental question: where does your ultimate loyalty lie? For National Socialism, there is only one answer: with the folk, unconditionally and entirely. In The Concept of Freedom and Defensive Readiness, Jung dissects one of the most potent political slogans of the modern era, arguing that true freedom is not an abstract universal principle, but an expression of a people's deepest racial and spiritual character. He contrasts the hollow, deceptive freedoms offered by liberalism, democracy, and Marxism with the genuine, profound freedom inherent in the Germanic spirit. For Jung, this authentic freedom is inextricably linked to a nation's will and capacity for self-defense. A people that cannot or will not fight for its existence is, by definition, unfree. This chapter is a call to purge Germany of alien political concepts and rediscover a form of liberty worthy of its folk. Jung begins by systematically dismantling the models of freedom championed by Germany's enemies and internal detractors, exposing them as unsuitable and corrosive to the German character. English freedom Jung, echoing Oswald Spengler, argues that English freedom is a merchant's freedom. It is external and political, championing the individual's right against the state. However, it is purchased at the cost of inner bondage to conformist thinking, herd instinct, and a materialist philosophy, like Darwinism, that denies inner independence. The English state is not a true state, but a society of private individuals, a concept alien and inadequate to the German spirit of community. French freedom. The French ideal is even more alien, oscillating between the poles of anarchy and despotism. It is rooted in a rejection of all subordination and order, a chaotic impulse that Jung attributes to France's status as a bastard race, whose better Germanic elements were purged during the Revolution. This model offers only disorder or tyranny, never a stable, organic liberty. Against these foreign models, Jung posits a specifically German conception of freedom, which he finds best exemplified in its Prussian manifestation. This is not freedom from the state, but freedom through the state. The Prussian instinct. He quotes Spengler's Maxim. The German, or more precisely Prussian instinct was, power belongs to the totality. The individual serves the totality. Freedom here is found in willing service, duty, and subordination to the greater good of the national community. This creates a people of immense inner strength, faith, and selflessness, averse to all outer trappings. The archetype is Frederick the Great's description of himself as the first servant of his state. The limits of Prussianism. Jung acknowledges that this model, while noble, carried the risk of descending into rigid centralism and formalism, as it did in its later years. Its weakness was its anti-revolutionary character, which could lead the totality to perish under weak leadership rather than remove it, as would have happened in France. Jung proposes a synthesis for the future, to retain the Prussian spirit's core of duty and self-sacrifice while infusing it with the creative diversity and aversion to centralism found in southern Germany. The goal is a state that is both strong and organic, This new German freedom would be manifest through political life, wide-ranging self-government, and a rejection of both state centralism and the centralistic compulsion of political parties. Economic life, protection for the inner freedom of conscience against coercion from both employers and trade unions. Spiritual life, the primacy of inner freedom of conscience above all else. Freedom through the will to power, the necessity of defensive readiness. The critical, inseparable corollary to this concept of freedom is Wehrhaftigkeit, defensive readiness. For Jung, a folk that has lost the will to fight for its existence has already surrendered its freedom. He mocks the pacifist slogan, "Never Again War," as a symptom of disease and degeneration. The test of 1918. The true failure of the Marxist revolution was not that it happened, but that it was cowardly and misdirected. A genuine socialist revolution, fired by a true will to freedom, would not have laid down its arms before the capitalist entente. Instead, it would have planted the red flag upon the trenches and declared war upon capitalism, turning the imperialist war into a revolutionary war of national and social liberation. This would have been an act of true freedom. The path to future freedom, Jung concludes that before external freedom can be won, the internal spirit must be renewed. The current gun-shy attitude of the masses makes rearmament pointless. The coming period of iron hardship will be necessary to forge a new will, purging the weakness of pacifism and materialism. True freedom will be born from the unbroken will to live and the rediscovered courage to defend it. In essence, the concept of freedom and defensive readiness argues that liberty is not given. It is taken and held through constant vigilance and strength. The National Socialist project is to replace the empty Jewish-inspired concepts of democratic and liberal freedom with a Germanic freedom rooted in duty, community, and an unshakable will to defend the folk's right to exist. A free people is an armed people, not just with weapons, but with the spirit to use them. In the concept of renewal in National Socialism, Jung articulates the spiritual and moral core of the movement, positioning it as a profound cultural revolution that must precede and inform any political or economic change. This renewal is defined as a dual struggle, an internal crusade against the soul-corrupting poison of materialism and an external war against its chief vessel and beneficiary, the Jewish spirit. Jung argues that a national socialist economic order cannot be built upon a population addicted to mammon. It requires a new type of man, one purified of selfishness and reconnected to the divine through a faith that is authentically German. This chapter is the theological and ethical foundation upon which the political program must rest. Jung begins by framing the concept of renewal as a direct confrontation with the defining sickness of the age, materialism. He observes the myriad movements striving for pieces of this renewal: youth groups, Wandervogel, gymnastic leagues, Turner, abstinent societies and heritage associations, but warns that their efforts will remain fragmented and ultimately fail unless channeled into a unified struggle against the root cause. The objective of this spiritual renewal is the systematic eradication of selfishness and its replacement with selflessness. For Jung, this is not a gentle call for personal betterment, but a declaration of war on the ideologies that promote the opposite, the rampant egotism, greed, and avarice fostered by the capitalist and Marxist systems, both of which are products of the materialist worldview. Jung identifies the Jewish spirit as the supreme engine of this materialist corruption and its most effective weapon in the pursuit of world domination. His critique extends beyond economics into the religious sphere, launching a bold attack on church Christianity for being an unwitting ally of Judaism. Jung argues that church Christianity made a fatal error by grafting the teachings of Jesus onto the Jewish Old Testament and equating the Christian All-Father with the Jewish God Yahweh, whom Jesus himself called the devil and the father of lies. This fusion provided a theological shield for Jewry, allowing them to be seen as God's chosen people and facilitating their acceptance into host nations. He further condemns the rigid centralism and international character of the churches, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, as markedly Jewish traits that suppress true national spirit in favor of a supranational loyalty. The path to a German faith, the People's Church, Volkskirche. Rejecting both the alien elements within Christianity and the naive attempts to revive Germanic paganism, which he dismisses as a doomed sectarian project, Jung outlines the National Socialist religious ideal, a German People's Church. This would not be a new church, but a transformation of the existing confessions. It would involve a purging of Jewish elements, like the Old Testament, a rejection of Roman centralism, and the development of a faith led by German priests imbued with its spirit. Jung's key insight is that every person and every Volk ultimately perceive the deity as corresponding to their own being. The German God is not the desert destroyer Yahweh, but the benevolent All-Father. This faith would be less concerned with liturgical rites and more with the deep internal religiosity that expresses itself in a love of nature and a sense of awe, the feeling that drives a city dweller to cherish a garden plot. A prerequisite for this renewal is the complete separation of church and state, not to limit faith, but to free it from foreign control and prevent its use as a tool of political power, e.g. Czech priests being used to undermine German communities in the Sudetenland. The concept of renewal ultimately argues that political power and economic reform are meaningless without a concurrent spiritual revolution. The Jewish spirit gives birth to materialism, which in turn provides the breeding ground for mammonism. One cannot defeat the economic system without also defeating the spiritual sickness that sustains it. Therefore, the National Socialist struggle is total. It must be waged on two fronts simultaneously. The spiritual front, liberating the German soul from alien religious concepts and materialist decadence to forge a new, selfless, and heroic German man. The economic front, breaking the power of mammon by abolishing unearned income and the interest slavery that is the economic expression of the Jewish spirit. Jung's message is clear. The renewal of the state must begin with the renewal of the soul. The external conquest of Lebensraum and the internal conquest of the financial system will only be possible once the German folk has rediscovered its spiritual strength and purity, turning away from the false gods of gold and individualism to embrace its destiny as a unified, productive, and faithful community. In Labor and Unearned Income, Jung presents the core economic theory of National Socialism, framing all of economic life as a fundamental struggle between the productive creator and the parasitic exploiter. This chapter moves beyond Marxist and capitalist analyses to establish a new Völkisch definition of class, one rooted not in the ownership of the means of production, but in the source of one's income. Jung argues that the primary social evil is not private property itself, but unearned income, Arbeitsloses Einkommen, wealth acquired without productive labor. The National Socialist economic revolution, therefore, is not aimed at abolishing property, but at liberating the full proceeds of labor for the creative folk by systematically eradicating the mechanisms of parasitism. Jung's most significant ideological contribution in this chapter is his redefinition of the class struggle. He explicitly rejects the Marxist dichotomy of proletariat versus bourgeoisie as a narrow and misleading construct. The producer, der Schaffende. For Jung, the productive class includes anyone who lives from the earnings of their own honest labor, whether intellectual or physical. This encompasses the artist, the inventor, the entrepreneur, the peasant, the forester, the teacher, the civil servant, the tradesman, the factory worker, and the housewife. The quintessential characteristic of the German folk, in his view, is this innate creative, productive impulse, the joy of creation. The Moocher, der Raffender. The opposing class is the recipient of unearned income. This includes those who live off ground rent, interest, and speculative profits extorted from the misery of one's fellow man. These are the sons of the desert, transplanted into the sea of houses that is the metropolis, whose entire focus is on reaping where they have not sown. Their nature is fundamentally alien to the Germanic spirit of creation. This reframing allows National Socialism to position itself as the class party of productive labor, seeking to unite the vast majority of Germans, irrespective of their trade or social status, against a small parasitic minority. Jung passionately argues that the central injustice of the economic order is that the producer is systematically robbed of the full proceeds of his labor. A portion of his rightful income is always siphoned off by the moocher before he ever receives it. He outlines what fair pay would truly entail, not egalitarian sameness, but remuneration that allows a worker to live free from want, supports a family, and rewards the value, difficulty, and skill of the work to the community. He contrasts this ideal with the reality of his time, the factory worker earning a pittance while the factory owner enjoys a 10% return on capital, the diligent worker paid the same as the slacker, the chair brigand who grows rich without effort. This theft is not accidental but structural, engineered through two primary mechanisms of unearned income, ground rent and interest. Jung provides a detailed, albeit polemical, economic analysis of these two concepts. Ground rent, Bodenrente. This is the income derived solely from ownership of raw land, separate from any improvements made upon it. Jung explains that its value arises from the community's growth and collective work, yet it is captured by private individuals. He demonstrates how urban land values skyrocket due to population density and public investment, creating immense, effortless fortunes for landowners, while imposing a heavy tax on everyone else simply for the right to live and work on the land. Interest, Zins, this is the even more pernicious form of unearned income. Jung dismisses the concept of money's intrinsic value as a superstition and explains interest as a toll extracted due to the artificial scarcity of currency. He illustrates its monstrous exponential growth through compound interest with a devastating example. A single penny invested at the time of Christ's birth would, by the 20th century, amount to a sum greater than a solid gold planet. This demonstrates the inherent absurdity and unsustainable nature of an interest-based economy. He contrasts the rapid, effortless expansion of financial capital, e.g. the Rothschilds' rise from nothing to owning 40 billion marks, with the slow, labor-intensive growth of industrial capital, e.g. the Krupp works, framing it as the eternal contrast between the Germanic productive urge and the Jewish commercial spirit of usury. Labor and unearned income concludes by establishing the non-negotiable economic mission of the movement. The goal is to create an economic order where the value created by productive labor flows entirely to the producer. This requires nothing less than the total abolition of unearned income. Therefore, the National Socialist economic program must be abolitionist. Its central aim is the eradication of the mechanisms of rent and interest. Revolutionary. It seeks to overturn the entire financial and property system that enables parasitism. Productivist. It champions a society that honors and rewards creative work, whether of the hand or the mind. This chapter provides the economic justification for the reforms Jung will later detail. It argues that the struggle is not between workers and owners, but between the entire productive Volk and the parasitic few who live off them. In Economic Reform or Revolution, Jung delivers the definitive National Socialist rebuttal to Marxist theory, arguing that the revolutionary path to a communist utopia is not only a catastrophic failure, but also a philosophical absurdity. This chapter is a pivotal ideological confrontation, positioning National Socialism as the true heir to the German socialist tradition by championing purposeful creative reform work over the destructive, hate-driven doctrine of class war and expropriation. Jung asserts that materialism cannot build socialism, that the Marxist revolution inevitably strengthens the very capitalism it claims to oppose, and that the only viable path to a just economic order is through systematic reform that eradicates the root causes of exploitation, unearned income and the power of loan capital. Jung begins by highlighting the total failure of revolutionary experiments in Bavaria, Hungary, and Russia. He dismisses them as Jewish Bolshevik dictatorships characterized by murder, fire, devastation, the gagging of different opinions. More importantly, he argues that their failure was inevitable because they were built on a foundation of hate and materialism, which are incapable of fostering the altruism and self-sacrifice required for a genuine socialist community. A socialism born of envy, he contends, can only degenerate into orgies of hatred and destruction. He then turns the Marxist critique back on itself, using the words of its own leaders to demonstrate its intellectual collapse. He quotes the scholarly luminaries of Austrian social democracy, Karl Renner and Otto Bauer, who, after the revolution failed to materialize, began advocating for a gradual, planned reorganization of the economy. For Jung, this is a stunning admission of defeat, a silent acknowledgement that the revolutionary fervor of 1918 had merely delivered the German working class into the hands of international loan capital, as evidenced by the enslaving reparations of the Versailles Treaty. The revolution did not overthrow capitalism, it became its ultimate servant. Jung identifies several core flaws in Marxist theory that doom it to failure and make it a weapon of destruction rather than construction. The misplaced enemy Marxism foolishly fights national capital, the productive industrialist like Krupp, while leaving truly international Jewish loan capital utterly untouched. It attacks the symptom while protecting the disease. The materialist contradiction, socialism as the highest altruism, is philosophically incompatible with materialism, which is the most flagrant egotism. A system built on a foundation of class hatred can never create a society based on communal love and duty, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Jung points out the hypocrisy of seeking to replace one form of state oppression, the bourgeois class state, with another, the proletarian class state. This merely changes the master, not the condition of slavery. He mocks the Marxist militarism and class consciousness as pale imitations of the very structures they claim to despise. Having discredited the revolutionary path, Jung reaffirms the National Socialist commitment to reform as stated in the Salzburg Guiding Principles. Not revolution, but purposeful, creative reform, work alone can overcome today's untenable social conditions. This reformism is not timid but radical and targeted. It seeks a revolution of the spirit and the law, not the street. Its aim is not the expropriation of all property, but the surgical removal of the specific economic mechanisms that facilitate exploitation, the abolition of unearned income. The core of the reform agenda is the eradication of ground rent and interest, the two pillars of the parasitic economy. This strikes directly at the power of loan capital. Monetary and land reform, implementing systems to break the slavery of debt and return the value of land to the community. Socialization of monopolies, the transfer of large-scale capitalist enterprises that function as private monopolies into public ownership. This approach is presented as intellectually sophisticated and genuinely revolutionary in its outcomes, as it attacks the economic essence of capitalism without triggering the chaotic violence that destroys the national community and opens the door to foreign domination. Economic reform or revolution is designed to be the coup de grace against Marxism. Jung concludes that Marxism has irrevocably broken down, its leaders forced to adopt the reformist language of their rivals. The chapter positions National Socialism as the only coherent and viable socialist alternative. The choice is framed not between capitalism and socialism, but between two paths to a social economy. The Marxist path, a violent, internationalist, and materialist revolution that leads to dictatorship, destruction, and enslavement to global finance. The National Socialist path, a Völkisch, reformist, and spiritual revolution that eradicates parasitism through legal and economic restructuring, liberating the productive forces of the nation and creating a true working community of all who produce. By championing reform, National Socialism claims the mantle of true revolutionary change, a change that is reasoned, lasting, and ultimately more profound. It is the path that builds rather than burns, unites rather than divides, and saves the Volk rather than sacrificing it on the altar of a failed internationalist dogma. Abolition of unearned income through land law reform and monetary reform. In this critical chapter, Rudolf Jung transitions from economic theory to concrete policy, outlining the precise mechanisms by which National Socialism will execute its core mission, the abolition of unearned income, Arbeitsloses Einkommen. He presents a detailed, two-pronged program of radical reform targeting the foundational pillars of the parasitic economy, land and money. This is not a call for vague socialization, but a specific set of legal and financial instruments designed to dismantle the power of rentiers and financiers while protecting the productive property of the German folk. The chapter serves as the definitive economic manifesto of pre-Hitlerian National Socialism, advocating for a revolutionary restructuring of society through reformist means. Jung begins by reiterating that the struggle is not against private property as such, but against the specific forms of property income that are extracted without labor. The two primary targets are ground rent, Bodenrente, the income derived from the mere ownership of land, which increases due to community growth and not the owner's effort. Interest, Zins, the income derived from the control of money and credit, which grows exponentially through compound interest and enslaves producers and nations alike. The goal is to ensure that the full proceeds of labor flow to the producer by severing these leeches from the national economy. Jung evaluates the two primary methods for achieving land reform: expropriation and state leasehold. This method, advocated by Silvio Gesel's free land movement, involves the state buying all land and leasing it to the highest bidder. Jung vehemently rejects this. He condemns it as internationalist, as it would allow the highest bidder, whether Jew or Zulu Kafir, to acquire German soil, and anti-Völkisch. It would make the money bag the deciding factor, further empowering capital over the rooted productive Volk. The single tax on land value, Henry George model. This is the model Jung and the mainstream Völkisch land reform movement, for example Adolf Damaschke, endorse. It leaves land titles with current owners, but imposes a tax equal to the full rental value of the unimproved land. This single tax would confiscate the ground rent for the benefit of the community, effectively making the state the common landlord without the chaos of dispossession. Jung justifies this by arguing that ground rent is a creation of the whole community, and thus necessarily belongs to the whole community. This approach aligns with the old Germanic principle that land is ultimately the property of the Volk, with individuals holding it in stewardship. The proposed reforms, including a Homestead Act, a land value tax, state preemption rights, and debt relief for sound homeowners, are designed to make this principle a legal reality, breaking the speculative land monopoly and ensuring every German family has access to soil. Jung's program for monetary reform is even more radical, aiming at the complete breaking of interest slavery, Brechung der Zinsknechtschaft, a cause championed by Gottfried Feder. The immediate and paramount goal is addressing the state's debt, particularly the crushing reparations from Versailles, which represent the ultimate weapon of financial enslavement. The proposed solution is the conversion of government debt into non-interest-bearing securities. The state would meet its obligations to small pensioners and vulnerable citizens through tax revenues and surpluses from nationalized industries. For new public investments, it would issue non-interest-bearing treasury bills to be repaid from the earnings of the projects they finance. This would free the state from the vampire-like drain of compound interest, which threatens to double and redouble its debt in a geometric progression of doom. The ultimate goal is the complete elimination of interest in both public and personal credit. This would be achieved by nationalizing the banking system and abolishing the stock exchange, transforming credit from a tool of exploitation into a public utility for fostering productive enterprise. Jung clarifies that National Socialism advocates for the socialization, Vergesellschaftung, of large-scale enterprises that constitute private monopolies. This is not a blanket nationalization, but a targeted strategy for industries where competition is impossible or harmful to the common good, e.g., utilities, mining, railroads. Crucially, he distinguishes this from the Marxist model of state control. The preferred entities for ownership are not the central state, but municipalities and provinces understood as ethnically defined, self-governing bodies. This decentralized approach prevents the creation of a Leviathan state and keeps ownership anchored in the living, organic communities of the Volk. Land value tax to reclaim ground rent for the community. Debt conversion and state credit to break the power of interest. Socialization of monopolies to prevent private control over essential public goods. Jung concludes that this program is the only logical outcome of the National Socialist worldview. It is a plan for a revolution without bloody class war, achieving through legislative and policy means what Marxism promised but could never deliver: an economy freed from the clutches of the rentier and the financier, where the value created by the productive labor of the German folk finally flows to its rightful owners. It is the blueprint for building the free social pan-Germany. In cooperatives and profit sharing, works councils, Jung outlines the National Socialist vision for a post-capitalist economic order based on cooperation and organic collaboration within the productive estate. This chapter moves beyond the negative program of abolishing unearned income to describe the positive, constructive institutions that will define the working community of the National Socialist state. Rejecting both the class war doctrine of Marxism and the exploitative hierarchies of capitalism, Jung proposes a system of shared ownership and managed collaboration designed to harmonize interests, elevate the worker from a mere wage earner to a stakeholder, and embed the economy firmly within the Völkisch community. This represents the practical application of the movement's slogan, "The influence of work and skill in state and society is our goal." Jung champions the cooperative, Genossenschaft, as the ideal model for economic organization, seeing it as a modern incarnation of the Germanic cooperative spirit that animated the medieval guilds. Cooperatives represent a third way between rigid state control and anarchic private competition. Consumer cooperatives. These are endorsed as a means for the productive folk to protect themselves against exploitative pricing and monopolistic practices, ensuring that the necessities of life are provided at fair cost. Producer and credit cooperatives. These are presented as vital tools for small artisans, farmers, and entrepreneurs, allowing them to pool resources, access credit on fair terms, and compete effectively without being crushed by large capitalist trusts or ensnared by loan capital. The cooperative model is inherently anti-parasitic. It eliminates the middleman and the speculator, directing benefits back to the member producers and member consumers, thus reinforcing the circular flow of a healthy national economy. A central pillar of Jung's constructive program is the implementation of profit sharing for all employees. This is not conceived as a charitable bonus, but as a fundamental right and a strategic necessity. The goal is to give the workforce, physical and intellectual workers both, a share of the profits within their enterprises, thereby giving them an interest in the revenue. This policy is designed to achieve several critical objectives. Eliminate class antagonism. By tying a portion of the worker's income directly to the success of the enterprise, profit sharing aligns the interests of labor and management. The worker is no longer a disinterested party selling his time for a fixed wage, but becomes the invested stakeholder in the productive outcome. Boost productivity. A worker who shares in the profits has a direct incentive to increase efficiency, improve quality, and eliminate waste. This transforms labor from a grudging obligation into a collaborative effort for mutual gain. Create a path to ownership. Jung suggests that profit sharing can be a stepping stone toward gradually increasing the worker's equity stake in the enterprise, potentially evolving into full cooperative ownership over time. This fulfills the National Socialist principle that property should serve labor. Jung addresses the role of works councils, Betriebsräte, institutions that arose from the post-war revolutionary movements. He seeks to strip them of their Marxist character and repurpose them for the National Socialist vision. Rejection of the Soviet model. He utterly rejects the Marxist concept of councils, Räte, as instruments of class struggle and dual power, which lead only to chaos and economic paralysis as seen in Bavaria and Russia. Councils as organs of collaboration. In the National Socialist state, works councils are to be transformed into internal organs of the enterprise. Their purpose is not to confront management, but to collaborate with it. They would be forums for addressing practical grievances, improving working conditions, advising on technical and organizational improvements, administering the profit-sharing scheme, fostering a spirit of shared responsibility for the health of the enterprise. This model transforms the council from a battlefield between classes into a joint committee of the working community, focused on the common goal of productive success. The aim is to replace the capitalist cycle of exploitation and the Marxist cycle of hatred with a system of organic collaboration. By promoting cooperatives, implementing profit sharing, and transforming works councils into collaborative bodies, National Socialism seeks to economically empower the productive Volk, dissolve class conflict into class cooperation, ensure that the economy serves the community, not the speculator, create a society where every worker has a direct stake in the fruits of his labor. This chapter demonstrates that National Socialism's economic ideal is not a cold, centralized tyranny, but a decentralized, associative economy where ownership is widely distributed, interests are harmonized, and the Germanic spirit of cooperative production is restored to its rightful place. It is the practical embodiment of the slogan, "The common good before the individual good." In parliament or councils, Jung engages in a definitive critique of modern democratic systems and explores alternative models of governance for the future National Socialist state. This chapter is a direct assault on the perceived failures of liberal democracy and Marxist socialism, arguing that both the parliamentary system and the Soviet Council model lead to the destruction of national unity and effective governance. Jung concludes that the National Socialist state must transcend this false dichotomy altogether, forging a new, organic form of representation based on the estates of the productive Volk, which would ultimately be guided by the principle of leadership, Führerprinzip. Jung's condemnation of parliamentarism is comprehensive. He does not see it as rule by the people, but as party terrorism. His central criticism is that it institutionalizes division and prioritizes partisan interests over the national interest. The system ensures that power is seized not by the best and most capable, but by the most conniving party politicians. Governments and officials feel responsible only to their party apparatus, leading to cronyism, corruption, and a perpetual focus on political gamesmanship rather than effective governance. Jung argues that financially powerful interest groups can easily manipulate elections and parliamentary processes. The result is that mammonism sets the agenda, and the state becomes a servant to capital rather than the embodiment of the people's will. He cites the behavior of Reichstag members, incapable of confidentiality and prone to gossip, as evidence of the system's immaturity and its inability to handle grave national crises with the required seriousness and resolve. In the wake of World War I, the council system emerged as the Marxist alternative to parliamentarism. Jung is equally dismissive of this model, viewing it not as an upgrade, but as a more destructive form of the same illness. The Soviet system is explicitly designed as a tool for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Its purpose is not to unify the nation, but to intensify class struggle, pitting one segment of the folk against another. Despite its anti-parliamentary rhetoric, Jung contends that the council system merely replaces the tyranny of parliamentary parties with the tyranny of a single radical party, e.g. the Bolsheviks, enforcing its will through violence and terror. Rejecting both foreign imports, Jung proposes a distinctly German third way. The solution is not to choose between parliament and councils, but to move beyond both toward an organic state structure. The National Socialist ideal is a state organized not by geographical districts or class interests, but by estates or occupations, Stände. This would involve a bicameral system with a political chamber and an economic chamber, Wirtschaftskammer, based on occupational representation. Representation from all branches of the productive economy, industry, agriculture, handicrafts, the professions, allowing for practical, expert guidance on legislation affecting economic life. This system is designed to transcend party squabbles and represent the authentic, functional interests of the folk as a productive community. The principle of leadership, Führerprinzip. Underpinning this entire structure is the rejection of the anonymous bureaucratic state and the Roman Jewish concept of rulership. It is to be replaced by the Germanic concept of leadership. Authority would flow not from a majority vote, but from the demonstrated ability, responsibility, and commitment of leaders at every level who are tasked with executing the will of the community for the common good. The role of plebiscites. Jung allows for a limited corrective role for direct democracy through plebiscites or referendums on major issues. This serves as the ultimate check on potential abuses of power and a way to gauge the will of the folk on fundamental questions without devolving into the daily chaos of parliamentary politics. This chapter positions National Socialism as the only force capable of resolving the political crisis of modernity by offering a vision that is neither liberal nor Bolshevik, but authentically German, a state without parties, without class conflict, and without parliamentary intrigue, rooted in the principles of leadership, duty, and the organic unity of the nation. In the chapter German Law, Jung articulates a core tenet of the National Socialist worldview, that a people's legal system is not a universal, abstract construct, but a direct expression of its unique racial soul and spirit. This chapter is a polemic against the dominance of Roman law in the German states, which Jung condemns as an alien imposition that has warped the Germanic character, facilitated social injustice, and empowered the parasitic classes. The call for a return to German law is thus not a mere legal reform, but a fundamental aspect of the Völkisch renewal, essential for creating a legal order that protects the productive Volk and reflects their innate sense of justice, community, and honor. Jung begins by romanticizing the old Germanic legal tradition, which he presents as the organic product of the Volk's character. This system was fundamentally different from the rigid codes that would later supplant it. Germanic law was not decreed from above by scholars or rulers, but emerged from the customs and collective conscience of the folk community. It was practiced in the open-air thing assemblies, where free men deliberated and decided matters based on a shared understanding of right and wrong. The foundational principle was cooperative law, Genossenrecht, which emphasized communal rights and responsibilities. Land was held by the village cooperative, Markgenossenschaft, and law served to balance individual enterprise with the welfare of the community. Justice was intuitive and focused on achieving a fair outcome. Procedures were straightforward, accessible, and designed to serve the common man, not to enrich a class of professional lawyers. Jung identifies the reception of Roman law in the German territories as a historical catastrophe of the highest order, a cultural defeat that corrupted the Germanic spirit. He characterizes Roman law as the product of a slave-holding, imperialistic, and deeply materialistic civilization. It was a law designed for domination and absolute property rights, dominium, making it the perfect instrument for the powerful to subjugate the weak. The introduction of Roman law enabled the perversion of the old land law. It replaced the Germanic concept of land as a conditional trust with the Roman concept of land as absolute, alienable private property. This legal shift is what made the land monopoly, ground rent, and the dispossession of the peasantry possible. It created the legal framework for the saleability of land and the heritability of fiefs, the very foundations of unearned income. Roman law was complex, written in Latin, and required a specialized class of interpreters, lawyers, and judges. Jung, quoting Luther's scorn for villainous lawyers, argues that this new legal priesthood became a means of oppressing the poor, justice became expensive and incomprehensible, and the law was transformed from a shield for the people into a weapon for the rich and usurious. The call for a return to German law is therefore a central plank of the National Socialist Revolution. It involves a comprehensive overhaul of the legal system to make it serve the Völkisch community once more. The legal foundation for absolute private property rights, particularly in land, must be dismantled. The law must once again distinguish between earned property, houses, improvements, and unearned property, the value of raw land, restricting the latter for the common good. The new legal code must institutionalize the precedence of the community's welfare over individual profit. This would provide the legal basis for land reform, the abolition of interest slavery, and the fight against monopolies. The legal system must be purged of its complexity and return to a state where every German can understand his rights and obligations. Justice should be swift, accessible, and delivered by judges imbued with the National Socialist worldview who seek substantive justice rather than hiding behind procedural technicalities. Implicitly, German law would also be a racial law. It would actively discriminate against the racially foreign and the parasitic, denying them the protections offered to productive members of the Völkisch community. It would legally codify the struggle against the Jewish spirit. German law concludes by framing the legal struggle as a vital front in the broader war for Germany's soul. The current legal system is portrayed as a key pillar supporting the corrupt Mammonist order and the power of international finance. A return to German law is not an antiquarian fantasy, but a revolutionary act. It is about creating a juridical framework that reflects the Germanic values of community, honor, and productive labor, protects the worker, the peasant, and the homestead from the predations of the speculator and the usurer, empowers the state to act decisively in the interest of the folk's health and prosperity. For Jung, you cannot have a National Socialist economy without a National Socialist law. The two are inseparable. The Roman law of the absolute right of property must be annihilated and replaced with a German law of obligation and community, transforming the legal system from an instrument of exploitation into a weapon for Völkisch renewal and liberation. In The German People's State, Jung culminates his ideological project by presenting the positive vision of the political entity that National Socialism seeks to build, the Volksstaat. This is not a state in the liberal or Marxist sense, but an organic, racial, and spiritual totality, the political embodiment of the unified will of the German Volk. The chapter synthesizes the movement's critiques of democracy, capitalism, and internationalism into a coherent blueprint for a state that is neither reactionary nor proletarian, but revolutionary in its commitment to Völkisch socialism. The Volksstaat is defined by its purpose, to secure the existence of the folk and to create the conditions for the highest flourishing of every productive member within the national community. The Volksstaat is not an artificial construct based on a social contract or a written constitution. It is the political organization of the organic folk community. Its borders, in the ideal sense, are the borders of the German folk itself, a goal to be achieved through the consolidation of all German territories into a pan-German Reich. Its authority derives not from the consent of the governed in the democratic sense, but from its success in representing and executing the collective will and destiny, Schicksal, of the folk. It is a state with a mission, and its legitimacy is contingent upon its effectiveness in fulfilling that mission. Jung defines the Volksstaat in opposition to the failed models it is destined to replace against the party state. It will eradicate the party terrorism and divisive squabbling of parliamentarism. The state must be elevated above the fray of petty partisan interests to represent the unified will of the nation. Against the class state, it will dissolve the Marxist dichotomy of proletariat and bourgeoisie, along with the corrosive ideology of class struggle. It recognizes only one fundamental division between the productive and the parasitic. Against the liberal state, it rejects the notion of the state as a passive night watchman whose primary role is to protect private property. The Volksstaat is an active, interventionist entity that subordinates all economic activity to the welfare of the Volk. Against the Jewish state, it will purge all racially foreign influence, particularly the Jewish commercial spirit, from positions of power in public life, culture, the economy, and the press. The state must be an instrument of the German spirit alone. Jung outlines a state structure that rejects both liberal democracy and Soviet dictatorship in favor of a hierarchical, organic model. Authority is not derived from majority vote, but from demonstrated ability, responsibility, and dedication to the Volk. The state will be led by a hierarchy of leaders, from the national Führer down to local officials, each appointed based on merit and their capacity to execute the national will effectively. This replaces the anonymous, bureaucratic state with a system of personal responsibility and authority. To replace the partisan parliament, Jung proposes a system of representation based on estates or occupations. This would involve a chamber composed of delegates from all branches of the productive economy, industry, agriculture, handicrafts, the intellectual professions, who can advise on legislation from a standpoint of practical expertise rather than ideological rivalry. The will of the folk is not expressed through daily politics but may be consulted on fundamental, existential questions for the nation through plebiscites. The primary role of the citizen, however, is not to debate but to serve. The highest virtue is duty to the community, and the state is the vehicle through which that collective duty is organized and realized. The Volksstaat is inherently a socialist state. Its economic mission is absolute and non-negotiable to abolish unearned income. The state must use its sovereign power to break interest slavery, confiscate ground rent for the community through land value taxation, and eradicate the legal and financial mechanisms that allow for parasitism. To socialize monopolies. Key industries that function as private monopolies must be transferred to public ownership, preferably to municipalities or provinces rather than the central state. To champion the producer. The state's entire legal and economic system will be designed to honor and protect productive labor, facilitate profit sharing, and support the cooperative model, ensuring that the economy serves the folk. Conclusion: the state as a means to a folkish end. The German People's State presents the state not as an end in itself, but as the most powerful instrument for achieving the ultimate goal, the preservation and enhancement of the German folk. It is a means to secure Lebensraum, to purify the race, to cultivate a true German culture, and to forge a harmonious, classless community of producers. Jung's Volksstaat is the answer to the collapse of 1918. It is a state built not on the shifting sands of liberal pluralism or the bloody tyranny of class war, but on the solid rock of racial unity and national solidarity. It is the political form demanded by the National Socialist slogan, "The common good before the individual good." In this state, the individual finds his highest freedom and purpose in his service to the organic whole, and the government's sole raison d'etre is to ensure that this whole, the German Volk, not only survives, but thrives and ascends. In the tasks of municipal policy, Jung descends from the grand vision of the Volksstaat to its most immediate and tangible manifestation, the municipality, Gemeinde. For Jung, the city or town is not merely an administrative unit of the central state, but the essential cell of the national body, the primary sphere where the National Socialist principle of the common good before the individual good must be realized in daily life. This chapter outlines a revolutionary program for urban governance aimed at dismantling the power of real estate speculators and financial capital, solving the social question at the local level, and transforming municipalities into healthy, affordable, and racially harmonious communities that serve the productive Volk. Jung argues that the social crisis of the industrial age, epitomized by overcrowded slums, exorbitant rents, and poor public health, is fundamentally a municipal crisis. It is in the cities that the exploitative nature of the capitalist system becomes most visible and most painful. Therefore, the conquest of municipal power is a primary and urgent task for National Socialism. It is where the movement can immediately begin to demonstrate the superiority of its Völkisch socialist policies and deliver tangible improvements to the lives of the working folk. The core enemy, the land speculator. The central villain in Jung's analysis of urban problems is the land speculator and the system of ground rent. He identifies the conversion of land into a speculative commodity under Roman law as the root cause of urban misery. Jung argues that the rising value of urban land is not created by the landowner, but by the community as a whole, through population growth, public investments in infrastructure, and general economic activity. Yet, this unearned appreciation is privately appropriated by speculators who contribute nothing. This system makes building land prohibitively expensive, preventing the construction of adequate housing and inflating rents to extortionate levels. The worker is forced to pay a large portion of his income simply for the right to exist on a piece of land, a form of tribute to the parasitic rentier class. Jung proposes a comprehensive municipal policy designed to break this cycle of exploitation and return the value of the community to the community itself. Land policy, Bodenpolitik. This is the most critical task. Jung championed the policies of the German land reform movement, e.g. Adolf Damaschke, which advocated for the land value tax, Bodenwertsteuer, a steep tax on the unimproved value of land. This would confiscate the economic rent for the public treasury, making land speculation unprofitable and forcing poorly utilized plots onto the market. Preemption rights, Vorkaufsrecht, giving the municipality the first right to purchase any land put up for sale, especially on its outskirts, to control urban expansion and secure land for public use at a fair price. Anti-speculation laws, penalizing the deliberate hoarding of vacant land and derelict properties through punitive taxes or outright expropriation. Housing and settlement policy, Wohnungs- und Siedlungspolitik. With land made available and affordable, the municipality must become the primary driver of housing construction. Mass construction of affordable housing. Using land acquired through its preemption policy, the city should finance and build large volumes of rental housing, not for profit, but at cost. Promotion of homesteads, Heimstätten. The ultimate goal is to enable every German family to own its own home on its own plot of land. Municipal policy should actively promote this through favorable financing, providing infrastructure and partitioning land for small homesteads. This roots the citizen to the soil, improves public health, and fosters a stable, conservative society. Public works and infrastructure, municipal ownership and operation of essential utilities, water, gas, electricity, transit, to provide these services at cost and prevent them from becoming sources of private profit. Social and cultural policy. The municipality has a duty to foster the physical and moral health of the folk. Public health. Expanding parks, swimming baths, and sports facilities to combat the physical decay of urban life. Völkisch education. Supporting schools, libraries, and community events that strengthen German culture and national consciousness against internationalist and Jewish influences. Social welfare, providing for the poor, sick, and elderly through municipal institutions, embodying the socialist principle of communal responsibility. The tasks of municipal policy presents the local level as the proving ground for the National Socialist Revolution. By taking control of city halls, the movement can immediately begin to demonstrate effectiveness, show the Volk that National Socialism can solve the pressing issues of daily life where other ideologies have failed. Break the power of finance, start dismantling the system of ground rent and interest slavery at its most visible point of exploitation. Build the new society, create concrete examples of the working community in action, from cooperative housing estates to municipally run utilities. For Jung, the healthy municipality is the foundation of the healthy Volksstaat. A nation is only as strong as its communities. By pursuing these policies, National Socialism does not just aim to win political power, but to fundamentally reshape the human environment, creating the physical and social conditions for a purified, productive, and powerful German Volk to thrive. It is the practical application of the motto, "A Volk who live freely upon free land are unconquerable."